The rifle in Micah Townsend's hands did not waver, though the woman standing on the porch of his father's ranch house did not so much as flinch at the sight of it. "You've got until I count 3 to tell me who you are," Micah said, "and why you're holding papers on land that belongs to the Townsend family." "You can count to 100 if it makes you feel better," the woman answered, "but the answer won't change. My name is Susan Dawson. I am a Deputy United States Marshal out of Fort Worth, and this deed in my hand says the Bar T Ranch belongs to Tobias Townsend, deceased, and by inheritance to his son Micah. So unless you intend to shoot the one person in the state of Texas trying to hand your land back to you, I'd suggest you lower that Winchester." Micah did not lower it. Not yet. He had ridden 2 days on a warrant that named a woman called Susan Dawson, wanted for forgery and fraud against the Cattlemen's Trust of the Texas Panhandle, last seen in the vicinity of Willow Creek. The poster had promised $500, and a sketch so poorly rendered it might have been any woman between 18 and 40 with dark hair. He had followed rumor and instinct to this ranch, his own boyhood home, half expecting to find a stranger salting away stolen paper in the barn loft. Instead, he had found a woman with steady gray eyes, a battered leather satchel, and a badge pinned inside her coat that caught the late afternoon light when the wind moved the fabric. "Anybody can pin on tin," he said, though his voice had lost some of its iron. "Anybody can print a wanted poster too," Susan said. "Which is exactly what somebody did with my name on it, Mr. Townsend, if that is who you are, because I have not committed forgery in my life, and I would very much like to know how a bounty hunter ended up on my trail 200 miles from where I started." The word bounty hunter came out of her mouth like something distasteful, and Micah felt it land the way a slap might. He lowered the rifle an inch, then another, until the barrel pointed at the porch boards instead of her heart. "They're a poster with your name on it," he said. "Fraud against the Cattlemen's Trust, $500 bounty." "There is," Susan said. "I have seen it myself, nailed to a post outside the land office in Amarillo. I tore it down, and I have it folded in my saddlebag right now, because it is the second piece of evidence I intend to lay before Judge Harlan Reeves when he holds hearing in Willow Creek 5 days from now, against a man named Silas Vane." It was late May of 1883, and the wind coming across the Panhandle carried the smell of wet grass and bluebonnets from a rain that had fallen the night before, and would likely fall again before dark. Micah Townsend stood in his father's dooryard, holding a rifle he no longer wanted to hold, looking at a woman he had crossed 100 miles of muddy trail to arrest, and understanding for the first time in 3 years of bounty work that he had been chasing a lie without knowing whose lie it was. He set the rifle against the porch rail. "You'd best come inside," he said, "and you'd best start from the beginning, Deputy Dawson, because I have a feeling I have been somebody's fool." Susan studied him a moment longer, weighing something behind those gray eyes, before she nodded and stepped past him through the door of the house that had, until that afternoon, belonged to neither of them and both of them at once. Inside, the ranch house still smelled faintly of the cedar his father had used to build the mantel, though 2 years of a bachelor's neglect had left dust on the shelves, and a coating of grime on the windows that let in gray light instead of gold. Micah set a pot on the stove out of habit more than hospitality, and did not look at Susan while he worked, because he did not trust his own face not to show the shame heating up beneath his collar. "Vane," he said finally, "I know that name." "Most everyone in the Panhandle does or will," Susan said. She had taken the room's one good chair without waiting to be offered it, and now she opened the satchel across her knees, careful as a woman handling a sleeping child. "Silas Vane holds himself out as a land agent working for the Texas and Gulf Railroad. He has spent the better part of 3 years buying up right-of-way through the Panhandle for a spur line that does not officially exist yet, and where ranchers would not sell, Mr. Vane found other ways to acquire their signatures." "Forged deeds," Micah said slowly. forged deeds, forged bills of sale, and at least one death certificate that lists a man as dying of natural causes when two witnesses in Amarillo will swear he was in perfect health the week before his ranch changed hands. Susan pulled a ledger from the satchel, its cover cracked and its pages soft with handling. This book records every transaction Vane's clerk made for 2 years. Names, dates, and the true owners beside the false ones he recorded for the county. Your father's name is in here, Mr. Townsend. Micah's hand found the back of a chair and gripped it. My father died of a bad heart, he said. The doctor in Clarendon signed the paper himself. Your father may well have died of a bad heart, Susan said, not unkindly. I'm not here to tell you otherwise, and I would not want to plant a grief in you that isn't earned. But the deed transferring this ranch to the Cattlemen's Trust, and from the trust into Silas Vane's private holdings 6 months later, is dated 3 weeks before your father's death, and it carries a signature that 11 different men in Clarendon will tell you does not match a single letter your father ever wrote in his life. I have that signature here. I have the real one, taken from a promissory note at the bank. You are welcome to compare them yourself. She held out 2 papers side by side, and Micah took them with hands that had grown suddenly unsteady, the same hands that had drawn on outlaws twice his size without a tremor. His father's true signature was cramped and careful, the letters of a man who had learned to write late in life and never lost his respect for the effort of it. The forged one was smoother, more confident, and wrong in a dozen small ways that became obvious once a person knew to look. Son of a bitch, Micah said softly, and then, remembering himself, pardon my language, deputy. I have heard worse said about Silas Vane, and said some of it myself, Susan answered, and for the first time something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. The deed I carry tonight is the original, recovered from a strongbox in Vane's Amarillo office by means I would rather not describe to a man I met at the point of his own rifle an hour ago. It restores this ranch to your father's estate, which means it restores it to you, assuming Judge Reeves confirms it Thursday morning as I expect him to. Thursday, Micah repeated. That's 5 days. 4, now that today is half spent, Susan said. I started from Amarillo with a deputy named Holly's Pratt riding escort. 2 nights ago, on the road past Tule Canyon, 6 men came down on our camp in the dark. Holly's took a bullet in the shoulder defending the wagon and is laid up in a farmhouse near Silverton, unable to ride, and I lost 1 horse and half my provisions getting the wagon clear of them. I have been traveling alone since, and slower than I would like, because a woman driving a wagon alone on the panhandle draws exactly the kind of attention I am trying to avoid. Micah looked at her with new eyes, seeing now the mud dried stiff on her skirt hem, the powder burn faintly visible on her coat sleeve, the exhaustion she had been holding at bay with something like pure will. You've been shot at, lost a partner, and rode 2 days alone with the one thing that can convict Silas Vane of stealing half the panhandle, he said, and you knock on the door of a stranger's ranch house. I did not knock, Susan said. You came around the corner of the barn with a rifle before I got the chance. Despite himself, Micah laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound that seemed to startle them both. Fair enough, he said. I reckon I owe you an apology, Deputy Dawson. You can pay that debt by getting me and this satchel to Willow Creek by Thursday morning, Susan said, all business again, though the corner of her mouth had not entirely lost its curve. I don't suppose a man who tracks people for a living happens to know the safest road. Micah looked at the ledger, and the false deed, and the true one, and thought of his father's cramped, careful signature, and felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years begin, very slowly, to loosen. I know every road in this country, he said, and after what you just showed me, deputy, I believe I've got more reason than you do to see you standing in front of Judge Reeves on Thursday morning. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain, and somewhere past the fence line, a mockingbird began working through another bird's song as though trying it on for size. Susan Dawson closed the ledger, tucked it back into the satchel, and looked at Micah Townsend as if deciding something. "Then we had best start early," she said, "before Vane realizes his hired guns didn't finish the job at Tule Canyon." They left before first light the next morning, Susan driving the wagon with the satchel wedged beneath the bench seat and a shotgun within reach of her right hand, Micah riding a rangy bay gelding named Ulysses a length ahead, and to the side, watching the tree lines the way a man watches things he has learned not to trust. The rain that had threatened the evening before had held off overnight, but the sky hung low and the color of a dirty dish rag, and the wildflowers that carpeted the draws in blue and gold looked strange under that light, too bright for the weather, like something determined to bloom despite every reasonable argument against it. "You never did tell me how you came to be chasing paper for a living," Susan said, an hour into the ride, when the silence between them had stretched long enough to grow its own kind of comfort. "Bounty hunting, I mean. It isn't a trade a man falls into by accident." "Man falls into most trades by accident," Micah said. "I fell into this one because I was good at finding people who didn't want to be found, and because there was a season in my life when I needed money faster than honest work provided it." "That's not an answer, that's a fence," Susan said. "I've spent 6 years reading men who don't want to say what they mean. You ride like someone who learned to watch his own back trail before he learned much else." Micah was quiet a moment, watching a hawk work the thermals above a line of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed. "I rode with some hard men for a while when I was younger," he said finally. "After my mother died and before my father got old, there was a stretch where the ranch wasn't making enough to keep both of us fed, and I went looking for faster money. I'm not proud of it. I got out before it got the better of me, and I built something honest out of the wreckage. That's the short version, and it's most of what you're entitled to on one day's acquaintance, Deputy." "Fair enough," Susan said, echoing his own words back at him without seeming to notice, or perhaps noticing entirely and choosing not to remark on it. "I won't pry at a man's scars before he offers to show me the wound himself." "Careful," Micah said. "That's a decent way to talk. Might make a man start liking you." "I've been told I have that effect," Susan said dryly, and flicked the reins, and the wagon rattled on down the trail while overhead the hawk folded its wings and dropped toward the grass, hunting something Micah could not see and did not envy. They made camp that first night in a stand of live oak beside a creek swollen brown with runoff, the water moving fast enough to argue with the rocks in its bed. Susan built the fire herself, refusing Micah's offer to do it, and he found himself watching the economy of her movements, the way she laid the kindling in a careful teepee and struck the match only once, with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times without a man standing over her shoulder to help. "You didn't grow up in a parlor," he observed, handing her a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag. "I grew up on a horse ranch outside Fort Griffin," Susan said. "My father broke horses for the Army before he broke his neck doing it, when I was 16. My mother had died birthing my younger brother 2 years before that, so it fell to me to finish raising him and keep the place running until it's sold. I learned to shoot because coyotes don't care whether the person minding the stock is a girl or a grown man, and I learned to read a ledger because the bank in Fort Griffin would have swindled a 16-year-old girl out of her inheritance in about a week if I hadn't. And the badge. Marshal Reeves's predecessor knew my father," Susan said. "Knew I could shoot straighter than most of his deputies, and read a false account faster than any of them. He hired me on to handle exactly this kind of work, evidence, transport, the parts that require patience and a level head instead of a fast gun. Some of the men in that office didn't care for it. Most came around once they saw I could do the job." She looked at him across the fire, the flames throwing moving light across her face. "You're not the first man to look surprised that a woman is doing what I do, Mr. Townsend, and you likely won't be the last, but I would take it as a kindness if you got over your surprise quickly. We've got 4 days and 100 miles of bad road between us and Willow Creek, and I need a partner, not an audience." "You've got one," Micah said, and meant it, and something in the set of Susan's shoulders eased, just slightly, as though she had been waiting to hear exactly that and had not quite believed she would. They reached the farmhouse near Silverton by mid-afternoon of the second day, a low sod-roof structure belonging to a German farming family named Cross, who had taken in the wounded deputy, Holly's Pratt, and nursed his shoulder with a poultice of comfrey and a great deal of stern German insistence that he not attempt to ride before the wound closed properly. Pratt was a broad, sandy-haired man near 50, and he greeted Susan's arrival with visible relief and Micah's presence with the flat, assessing stare of a lawman sizing up an unfamiliar face. "This the bounty man you mentioned might be trouble?" Pratt asked Susan, not taking his eyes off Micah. "This is Micah Townsend, and he was trouble for about 10 minutes 2 days ago," Susan said. "Since then he's been an asset. He's escorting me the rest of the way to Willow Creek." "You trust him?" "I trust his aim, and I trust that he has more reason than most men alive to want Sela's vein brought down," Susan said. "That'll do for now." Pratt studied Micah a moment longer, then extended his good hand. "Obliged to you then, whoever you are. That woman is worth more to the law of this territory than most of the men wearing badges in it, and I don't say that to flatter her. Watch the roads. Whoever came at us at Tule Canyon knew exactly what wagon to hit and exactly what night to hit it, which means somebody in Amarillo talks more than they ought." "I intend to find out who," Susan said. "Once Vane is behind bars and has no further use for loose lips." They stayed only long enough to water the horses and share a meal the Cross family insisted on providing: thick slices of bread and a stew of potatoes and salt pork that tasted better to Micah than anything he had eaten in months, though he suspected the company had as much to do with that as the cooking. Susan promised Pratt she would send word from Willow Creek once the hearing concluded, and by late afternoon they were back on the trail, the farmhouse and its worried, kindly family shrinking behind them into the gray-green distance of the plains. That night the rain that had been threatening for 2 days finally arrived, not the hard driving storm of high summer, but a cold, steady late-spring rain that soaked through Micah's coat within the hour, and turned the trail to a pace that sucked at the wagon wheels and slowed Ulysses to a plodding, unhappy walk. They took shelter as best they could beneath a rock overhang along a dry wash that was rapidly becoming considerably less dry, and shared a cold supper because no fire would catch in the wet, and sat close together for warmth in a silence that had stopped feeling uncomfortable somewhere around the second day, and had begun, instead, to feel like something neither of them wanted to disturb by naming it. "Tell me about your father," Susan said eventually, her voice pitched low beneath the sound of the rain. The real him, not the deed, not the fraud him. Micah considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "He was stubborn," he said finally. "Stubborn in a way that used to make me furious as a boy, because he'd rather lose a whole season's calves to a hard winter than borrow money he wasn't certain he could repay. He taught me to read weather off the color of the sky before he taught me my letters, and he never once raised a hand to me even when I gave him plenty of cause. When my mother died he didn't remarry, didn't even court, just worked the ranch harder and got quieter, and I think by the time I left home at 19 he'd have welcomed the company more than he ever let on. I didn't come back enough. I told myself I was building something, making money, proving I could stand on my own, and by the time I understood that none of that mattered near as much as coming home more often, he was gone, and I was 200 miles away collecting a bounty on a horse thief in Fort Worth." The rain kept falling, softer now, drumming a gentle rhythm against the rock overhang. "I'm sorry," Susan said. "You brought me his real deed and proved a murdering thief stole his ranch out from under a dying man," Micah said. "You don't owe me any more sorry than that, Deputy. You've already done more for my father's memory than I managed to do for him while he was alive." Susan was quiet a moment, watching the rain. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think a father measures his son's worth in visits home. I think, if your father was half the man you're describing, he was proud of you regardless, and would have told you so the very next time he saw you and been glad of the chance." Micah looked at her, at the rainlight silvering the edge of her dark hair, at the steady, unflinching honesty in her face, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular, dangerous warmth of being understood by a stranger who had somehow stopped being a stranger sometime in the last 2 days. "You're an unusual woman, Susan Dawson," he said. "I've been called worse," Susan said, "by men who meant it as an insult. I'll take it as a compliment from you." "It was meant as one," Micah said, and something in the quality of the silence that followed told him she had heard exactly what he meant by it. They reached the edge of the caprock the following afternoon, where the flat plains gave way without warning to a broken country of red rock canyons and dry washes cut deep by centuries of flash flood. And it was there, threading a trail along the rim of a canyon whose name Micah did not bother to mention because he did not want to think about what its steep walls might hide, that Jasper Creed found him. Micah had ridden ahead to scout a water crossing swollen by the previous night's rain, and Creed was simply there when he came around a stand of mesquite, sitting his horse in the trail as though he had been waiting an hour, which, Micah realized with a sick lurch, he probably had. "Micah Townsend," Creed said, and smiled with teeth that had gone brown and crooked in the 8 years since Micah had last seen him. "Look at you, bounty hunter now, respectable. I heard you'd gone straight and I laughed myself sick because I remember a boy of 19 who couldn't hold a rifle steady the first time we hit that stage outside Mobetty." "Creed," Micah said, and his hand drifted, without his quite meaning it to, toward the pistol on his hip. "Don't," Creed said, still smiling. "I'm not here to settle old business, not the kind that ends in shooting anyhow. I'm here to remind you that a man died on that stage road, Micah, a guard named Whitfield with a wife and 2 children in Mobetty, and while it wasn't your bullet that killed him, you were there, you rode with us, and the law in this state doesn't much care about the fine distinctions when it comes to felony murder. Every man on that stage road is guilty in the eyes of a jury, and I am the only living witness who can say your name was among them." Micah's mouth had gone dry. "What do you want, Creed?" "There's a woman traveling with you," Creed said, "carrying paper that would ruin a man named Silas Vane. Vane pays well for problems to disappear, and he has offered a great deal of money for that satchel of hers, more money than I've seen in one place since before you left the outfit. I want you to get it for me. Tonight, tomorrow, before you reach Willow Creek. You bring me that satchel, and I ride out of your life forever and never breathe a word to any lawman about Mobetty. You don't, and I promise you, Micah, I will walk into that courthouse myself and swear to Judge Reeves exactly what kind of man is escorting his star witness." "She'd never believe you over me," Micah said, though even as he said it he heard the doubt in his own voice. "Maybe not," Creed said. "But she doesn't have to believe me, Micah. All I have to do is say it loud enough in front of enough witnesses, and your name is poison from here to Austin regardless of what's true. You'll hang for Whitfield or you won't, but either way, every bounty you've ever collected, every reputation you've built these past years, it all rots the second I open my mouth. You've got 2 days, think on it." Creed wheeled his horse and rode off into the mesquite before Micah could answer, leaving him alone on the canyon rim with the sound of his own heartbeat too loud in his ears and the taste of old guilt rising sour in the back of his throat. He did not tell Susan that night. He told himself it was because there was nothing to tell yet, no decision made, no crime committed, only a threat hanging over him like weather that might blow past without breaking. He told himself a dozen things, lying beside the fire with his hat over his eyes, none of which let him sleep. The next day's ride was quieter than the 2 before it, and Susan noticed, because noticing was the whole of her trade. "Something's wrong with you today," she said, as they nooned beside a stock tank half full of rainwater, the horses drinking gratefully while a meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. "You've barely said 10 words since sunup, and you keep looking over your shoulder like you expect the devil himself on your trail." "Just tired," Micah said, which was true as far as it went and a lie in every way that mattered. Susan studied him with those steady gray eyes that seemed to see a good deal more than a person generally wanted seen, and did not press further, though the line of her mouth told him she did not entirely believe him. He hated the lie more than he had expected to. In 3 days she had gone from a name on a warrant to something he could not name yet but recognized the shape of, a person whose good opinion he wanted the way a man wants water in August, and here he was already failing her with a silence dressed up as fatigue. That evening, camped in a shallow draw with a good fire going for the first time in 2 nights, Susan brought out the ledger again, turning its pages by firelight, tracing entries with one finger. "There's a name here I keep coming back to," she said. "A man called Creed, Jasper Creed. Vane's clerk recorded 3 payments to him over the past year, each one after a piece of business Vane needed handled quietly. I don't know exactly what Creed does for Vane, but I'd guess it isn't surveying land." Micah went very still. "You know the name," Susan said. It was not a question. He could have lied again. The lie was right there, ready-made, tired, works too far behind us for it to matter now. But he looked at her across the fire, at the trust she had extended to him 3 days running, sharing her food, her watch, her father's memory, the true shape of her fear and her competence both, and he found he could not do it. "I rode with Jasper Creed," Micah said, "when I was 19 years old and desperate for money to keep my father's ranch afloat. We robbed a stage outside Mobedy. A guard named Whitfield was killed. I did not fire the shot that killed him, Susan. I swear that before God, but I was there, and the law does not draw fine distinctions for a man who rides with killers even if his own gun stayed holstered. I got out after that, got out and never looked back and built a life I thought had buried all of it. Creed found me 2 days ago on the canyon rim while I was scouting the water crossing. He wants me to steal your satchel for Vane. He says if I don't, he'll walk into Judge Reeves's courtroom and name me as Whitfield's killer alongside him, and it won't matter that it isn't true, because the accusation alone will be enough to hang a shadow over everything I've built." The fire popped and settled. Susan did not speak right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Micah's stomach turned to ice, certain he had just watched 3 days of hard-won trust collapse into rubble. "When were you going to tell me this?" Susan said finally, "if Creed hadn't forced your hand?" "I don't know," Micah admitted. "I wanted to believe I could handle it myself, keep it from touching you at all." "That is not your decision to make alone," Susan said, and there was iron in it now, the voice of a deputy marshal and not merely a woman by a fire. "I am the one carrying this ledger. I am the one Vane wants dead or discredited before Thursday. If a man is threatening to steal it from me, I need to know that the moment it happens, not 3 days into a silence I mistook for tiredness." "You're right," Micah said. "I'm sorry, Susan. I should have told you last night." She studied him a long moment, the anger in her face slowly giving way to something more tired and more complicated. "I believe you didn't fire the shot," she said. "I've read enough false confessions and true ones both to know the difference in a man's face when he says a hard thing, and yours had the shape of truth in it. But I need you to understand something, Micah Townsend. I did not survive an ambush at Tule Canyon and 2 days alone on the Panhandle to have the last leg of this journey undone by a man's fear of his own past. If Creed comes for this satchel, we face him together honestly, or we don't face him at all. I won't be lied to again. Not by you." "You won't be," Micah said. "Not again. I give you my word, and I intend to keep it better than I kept my silence." Susan held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, a small sharp motion that closed the matter for now, though Micah understood he had not fully repaired what his silence had cracked, only begun the slow work of it. "Then we plan," she said, closing the ledger. "Because if Vane knows we're close enough that he's sending Creed to intimidate you personally, he's running out of time and running out of patience, and a desperate man with money to spend is more dangerous than a careful one. They rode out at first light the next morning into a country that grew steadily more broken as they went, the flat grassland giving way to a maze of canyons and dry creek beds, where the trail Micah had chosen wound down into a narrow defile between two red rock walls that rose sheer on either side, high enough to block most of the gray morning sky. It was the fastest route to Willow Creek, cutting nearly a day off the journey around, and Micah had traveled it a dozen times in his bounty work and knew its twists the way he knew the calluses on his own palm. He did not know, until the first shot cracked off the canyon wall above them, that Jasper Creed had learned of the shortcut too. Down! Micah shouted, and Susan was already diving from the wagon seat before the word finished leaving his mouth, rolling into the lee of a boulder with the satchel clutched against her chest, while the wagon horses screamed and reared in their traces. A second shot kicked up dust a yard from where Susan had been standing a heartbeat before, and Micah saw the muzzle flash from a shelf of rock 30 feet up the canyon wall and returned fire without conscious thought, his Winchester bucking against his shoulder twice, 3 times, until the flash stopped answering. "How many?" Susan called, already reloading the shotgun she had pulled from beneath the wagon seat, her voice remarkably level for a woman under fire. "Can't tell yet. Creed said desperate men, so I'd guess he brought everyone Vane's money could buy." Micah swung down off Ulysses and slapped the gelding's flank hard enough to send him bolting up the canyon out of the direct line of fire, then dropped behind the same boulder sheltering Susan, close enough to feel the tension radiating off her. This canyon narrows up ahead into a slot, barely wide enough for one horse at a time. If we can get through it before they cut us off, the walls open out onto broken country full of hoodoos and washes that Creed doesn't know, because I'm the only man for 30 miles who's ridden it more than once. Another volley of shots answered from above, 3 rifles now by the sound of it, and rock chips stung Micah's cheek where a bullet struck close. "Then we run for the slot," Susan said. "You lead, I'll cover." "Susan, I can outshoot most men in that office in Fort Worth, and I have the shotgun loaded with buckshot that will make anyone up on that ledge reconsider their aim," Susan said. "This is not a discussion, Micah. Move." There was no arguing with the flat certainty in her voice, and no time to try. Micah broke from behind the boulder in a low crouching run toward the narrowing throat of the canyon, and Susan came a half step behind him, turning twice to fire the shotgun up at the rock shelf where the gunmen had positioned themselves, the boom of it echoing off the canyon walls like cannon fire, and sending a shower of rock dust down that momentarily obscured the shooter's aim. They reached the slot, a gap barely 6 feet across where 2 ancient rock falls had left a narrow passage between towering walls, and Micah pressed himself against the stone, waving Susan through ahead of him. "Keep going, I'll hold them a minute," he said. "Like hell you will," Susan said, and grabbed his sleeve with a grip surprisingly strong for someone half his weight. "We go together or we don't go at all. I did not ride 200 miles to leave you dying in a canyon so I could deliver a ledger alone, Micah Townsend." There was no time to argue that point either, and something in Micah's chest turned over at the fierce certainty in her face, at being fought for instead of merely protected. And then the decision was made for both of them as 3 riders came around the bend behind them at a hard gallop, Jasper Creed in the lead with his pistol already drawn. Micah and Susan ran the slot together, boot heels striking sparks off stone, and burst out the far side into a wilderness of red hoodoos and dry washes that spread in every direction like something poured from a giant's hand, the trail splitting a dozen ways among rock formations that all looked, to an unfamiliar eye, exactly alike. "This way," Micah said, pulling Susan into a wash that curved sharply left behind a formation shaped like a broken tooth. "It doubles back on itself twice and comes out a quarter mile from here near a stand of cottonwoods. If they follow the obvious trail, they'll ride straight past us and lose a mile finding their way back." They ran, low and fast, Susan's satchel banging against her hip, both of them gasping for breath in the thin, dry air, until they reached the cottonwoods Micah had promised and dropped into the cover of a fallen log to catch their breath and listen. Behind them, muffled by rock and distance, they heard shouting, and the sound of at least 2 riders continuing on down the wrong branch of the wash, exactly as Micah had predicted. "How did you know this country so well?" Susan whispered, still catching her breath. "Chased a horse thief through here 2 years back," Micah said. "Man near got away from me because he didn't know the ground either and panicked, rode himself into a dead-end canyon. I remembered the shape of it ever since. Man who knows the ground he's fighting on has an advantage no gun can match." Behind them, the shouting grew fainter, then stopped altogether, and after a long, tense stretch of silence broken only by wind hissing through the cottonwood leaves, Micah judged it safe enough to move again, working them in a wide loop back toward where he hoped Ulysses had run, staying low, staying quiet, checking their back trail every few dozen yards. They found the gelding grazing calmly a half-mile on, as though nothing at all had happened, and Micah nearly laughed at the absurdity of the animal's composure after what they had just survived. The wagon and its team, however, were nowhere to be found, likely bolted deep into the broken country in their panic, and with them had gone most of their remaining provisions and worse, a full day's advantage on the trail to Willow Creek. "We'll go on horseback," Susan said, when Micah voiced the problem aloud. "I can ride, Micah, and the satchel weighs nothing. We lose the wagon, we don't lose the evidence, and we don't lose the hearing date. 2 of us on 1 horse most of a day's ride is going to wear Ulysses down faster than I'd like," Micah said. "But you're right, it's what we've got. We can maybe recover the wagon team if we're lucky, or buy fresh mounts at the Cross Farm if we swing back that way, but either path costs us time we don't have. Best guess, Susan, we ride through tonight and reach Willow Creek by tomorrow noon if the weather holds." "Then we ride through the night," Susan said, without hesitation, and something in her readiness to simply decide and move, without complaint, without needing to be managed or reassured, struck Micah as more attractive than he was entirely prepared to admit to himself. They found a spot to rest the horse for an hour as the sun dropped low and orange over the broken canyon country, painting the red rock the color of old blood, and turning the scattered wildflowers on the canyon rim to small points of impossible blue against all that fire. Susan sat with her back against a boulder still warm from the day's sun, and Micah sat close beside her, closer than strict necessity required, and for a while neither of them spoke, both still feeling the aftershock of the gunfire in their hands and legs, the particular trembling exhaustion that follows a brush with death. "You saved my life today," Susan said finally, quietly. "Twice, if I'm counting honestly. Once at the boulder and once pulling me through that slot." "You saved mine right back," Micah said. "I was fully prepared to hold that gap alone and let you run, and you talked me out of my own foolish notion of chivalry inside about 4 seconds. "It wasn't foolish, it was reckless," Susan said, "which is a different thing, and I won't have it, Micah. Not for my sake. I didn't come this far to watch a good man throw himself away protecting me. I need a partner who intends to survive this alongside me, not a martyr." "Noted," Micah said, and something in his chest that had been tight with fear and adrenaline both began, slowly, to loosen into something else entirely, something that had been building for 3 days and had simply been waiting, apparently, for the right sunset to declare itself. He turned toward her, and she was already looking at him, her gray eyes catching the last orange light, and neither of them moved for a long moment, both of them, he suspected, weighing the same question and arriving at the same uncertain, aching answer. "Susan," he started to say, and did not get further, because she leaned in and kissed him before the rest of the sentence found its way out, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw, and he kissed her back with a fierceness that surprised him, born of fear and relief, and something that had been growing quietly beneath both since the moment she had refused to lower a shotgun for him on his own father's porch. When they finally drew apart, Susan's breath was uneven, and her eyes searched his face with an openness that had nothing of the deputy marshal's careful control left in it. "I don't know what that was," she said softly, "or what it means, given everything ahead of us. I have a hearing to reach and a career that I built with my own 2 hands, and I am not entirely certain what room is left in it for anything else, Micah, and I won't pretend otherwise to either of us." "I don't have an answer either," Micah admitted. "I've got a man threatening to hang an old sin around my neck, and a ranch I don't yet know if I'll keep, and no business asking a woman like you to build anything with a man whose future is this uncertain. But I know that whatever happens after Thursday, I wanted you to know I feel it too, and I didn't want to ride into whatever's waiting for us in Willow Creek without having said so." "Then we understand each other," Susan said, "which is more than most people manage before they kiss a second time." And she kissed him again, softer this time, less born of fear and more of choice. And when they finally pulled apart to rest before the long ride ahead, something unspoken but entirely real had settled between them, uncertain in its shape but undeniable in its existence. They reached Willow Creek shortly after noon the following day, the town rising up out of the plains in a scatter of false-fronted buildings along a single wide main street, churned to mud by cattle drives, and the recent rain. The Texas and Gulf Railroad survey stakes visible in orderly rows along the eastern edge of town, where the coming spur line was already claiming ground. Trail crews idled outside the saloon, their cattle bawling in the holding pens beyond, and merchants called out from doorways. And somewhere a piano played a tune slightly out of tune, and over all of it hung the particular electric anticipation of a town that knew a federal judge had arrived, and something of consequence was about to happen inside its little clapboard courthouse. Word of the courthouse hearing had evidently traveled ahead of them, because Silas Vane himself stood on the courthouse steps when they rode in, a lean gray-suited man with a diamond stickpin, and the easy smile of someone accustomed to buying his way out of consequence, flanked by 2 men Micah did not recognize, but whose posture marked them clearly enough as hired muscle. "Deputy Dawson," Vane called out, pleasant as a man greeting an old friend, though his eyes flicked to Micah with a cold assessment that made clear he knew exactly who had failed to deliver a certain satchel in a certain canyon. "I confess, I did not expect to see you looking so well. I had heard troubling rumors of ambushes and lost wagons along the Silverton Road. I do hope you weren't inconvenienced." "Only inconvenienced enough to arrive a day sooner than your hired men expected, Mr. Vane," Susan said, her voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd of onlookers on the boardwalk, "which I suspect is a greater inconvenience to you than it ever was to me." Vane's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and calculating. "I don't believe I follow you, Deputy." "You will," Susan said, "in about 1 hour, when Judge Reeves opens this hearing and I lay your own ledger, in your own clerk's handwriting, before the court, along with the true deed to the Townsend ranch that your forger tried to bury. I'd suggest you have your attorney ready, Mr. Vane, because I do not believe money will buy you out of what's coming." For just a moment, something like genuine fear flickered across Vane's composed face, quickly smoothed over, but Micah saw it, and knew Susan had seen it too, and felt a fierce pride in her that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with simple admiration for a woman doing her job better than anyone had ever expected her to. They tied off the exhausted Ulysses at the livery and made their way toward the sheriff's office to arrange proper protection for the satchel until the hearing, and it was there, on the boardwalk outside the office door, that Jasper Creed stepped out from between 2 buildings with a pistol already leveled, his face wild with the particular desperation of a man who has run out of every option except the last bad one. "That's far enough," Creed said. "Vane's paying double now that his hired guns failed in the canyon, and I intend to collect it myself. Hand over the satchel, Deputy, or I put a bullet in your bounty hunter friend and take it off your dead body if I have to." The street around them had gone suddenly, dangerously quiet, trail hands and merchants alike freezing in place at the sight of a drawn gun, and Micah felt the old cold clarity of a dangerous moment settle over him, the same steadiness that had served him through 3 years of bounty work. "Creed," he said, keeping his voice level, "you walk away right now, and I won't chase you. I owe you that much for what we once were to each other. But you point that gun at her and pull the trigger, and there is no amount of money on this earth that will keep me from finding you, however long it takes." "Touching," Creed said, though his gun hand trembled slightly. "But I've got nothing left to lose, Micah. Vane's already promised to name me in that ledger himself if I don't finish this job, so either way I hang unless I get paid enough to disappear to Mexico first." "Then you should know," Susan said, calm and clear despite the gun pointed near enough to kill her, "that I already have your name recorded in a deposition taken from Deputy Pratt in Silverton, describing the ambush at Tule Canyon in detail, including a physical description that matches you closely enough. Killing either of us here, in front of this many witnesses, does not save you from that rope, Mr. Creed. It only adds a murder in broad daylight to whatever else awaits you." Creed's eyes flicked toward the gathered crowd, the sheriff now visible emerging from his office at the sound of raised voices, and something in his desperate calculation seemed to shift, the gun wavering. It was in that half-second of hesitation that Micah moved, closing the distance in 2 long strides and driving Creed's gun arm upward and wide with his forearm, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the sky as the 2 men grappled, old familiarity with each other's fighting style making the struggle brief and ugly rather than prolonged. Micah drove a hard fist into Creed's jaw, felt the old outlaw's knees buckle, and had him face down in the mud with an arm wrenched behind his back before the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Otis Meeker, reached them with his own pistol drawn. "That's enough," Meeker said, taking in the scene with quick professional appraisal. "Somebody want to explain to me why there's a man face down in my street with a gun that just went off?" "This man is Jasper Creed," Susan said, stepping forward with her badge now visible, her voice steady despite the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. "Wanted in connection with an armed ambush on a federal wagon near Tule Canyon 4 days ago, and hired by Silas Vane to intercept evidence I am escorting to Judge Reeves's hearing this afternoon. I am Deputy United States Marshal Susan Dawson, Sheriff, and I would ask that you take this man into custody and hold him for federal questioning." Meeker's eyes cut toward Vane, still standing on the courthouse steps with his composure badly slipping now, the small crowd's attention swiveling toward him with a hostility that had clearly been building beneath the surface of Willow Creek's polite tolerance for some time. "Silas Vane," Meeker said slowly, as though testing the name for the first time in a new light, "you got anything to say about hiring outlaws to rob federal officers?" "This is preposterous," Vane said, though the tremor in his voice undercut the words. "That man is clearly some lunatic acting alone. I've never—" "He's got a ledger with your clerk's handwriting in it that says otherwise," Micah said, hauling Creed to his feet by the collar and shoving him toward the waiting sheriff. "And in about an hour, a federal judge is going to read every entry in it out loud in open court." Vane's 2 hired men had already begun edging back into the crowd, sensing the shift in the wind long before their employer did, and by the time Meeker had Creed's wrists bound and was turning his attention to Vane with clear new suspicion, the Diamond Stickbend land agent stood alone on the courthouse steps, his easy smile entirely gone, replaced by the pale calculation of a man beginning to understand that his money had finally stopped being enough. The hearing convened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the modest courtroom of the Willow Creek Courthouse, packed to its walls with ranchers who had lost land to Vane's schemes, merchants curious about the man who had spent freely in their town for 2 years, and trail crew hands who had simply never seen a federal judge before and did not intend to miss the show. Judge Harlan Reeves, a spare, silver-haired man with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had presided over a great many disputes and expected to be surprised by none of them, listened as Susan laid out the ledger entry by entry, the true and false deeds side by side, and Deputy Pratt's sworn deposition describing the ambush at Tule Canyon in detail that matched precisely both Jasper Creed's description and the account Micah gave of Creed's attempted blackmail on the canyon rim. Micah testified to his own history with Creed and the Mobedy stage robbery without flinching from any part of it, laying his old sin bare before the court exactly as he had laid it bare before Susan 2 nights earlier beside a dying fire, and watched the judge's face carefully as he did, bracing for the weight of consequence to fall. "Mr. Townsend," Judge Reeves said, when Micah had finished, "you understand that what you've just described could be construed as accessory to a felony resulting in death." "I do, Your Honor," Micah said. "I've carried that understanding for 8 years, and I did not come forward with it today to escape it. I came forward because Deputy Dawson deserved the whole truth from me before I let this court hear it secondhand from a man like Jasper Creed, and because I believe the people of this territory deserve to know exactly what kind of man Silas Vane hired to silence a federal officer." The judge studied him a long moment, then looked to Deputy Pratt's deposition again, and to a folded telegram that had arrived that morning, which he now produced and read aloud to the court. A statement, gathered years earlier, and only recently unearthed from federal archives in Austin, from a dying member of Creed's original gang, one Amos Fuller, who had confessed on his deathbed to firing the shot that killed the guard Whitfield outside Mobedy, and who had specifically named young Micah Townsend as a man who had refused to fire on the guard, and had, in fact, argued against the shooting before it happened. This statement has sat in a federal file for 6 years, unread and unmatched to any active case, Judge Reeves said, until Deputy Dawson's office requested a general record search on the name Jasper Creed 3 days ago in connection with this very hearing, and a clerk in Austin happened to notice the connection. "Mr. Townsend, it appears the law has been slower to clear your name than the truth deserved, but clear it now does. No charge will be brought against you in connection with the death of the guard Whitfield. Whatever debt you believed yourself to owe, you may consider it, as of this moment, fully paid." The relief that moved through Micah's body was so complete it left him briefly unsteady on his feet, and he felt Susan's hand find his beneath the low rail separating witnesses from the gallery, her fingers tightening around his in silent, fierce solidarity. The remainder of the hearing proceeded with the grim efficiency of a case already decided in every way but the formal reading of it. Silas Vane, presented with his own clerk's ledger and the true deeds recovered from his own strongbox, offered no defense that satisfied the judge, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon Judge Reeves had ordered his arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal officer, along with the immediate restoration of every falsely acquired deed listed in the ledger, including the Bar T Ranch, to its rightful owners or their heirs. Jasper Creed, already in custody, would face separate federal charges for the ambush at Tule Canyon and the attempted theft of evidence at gunpoint on Willow Creek's Main Street, charges that even his own desperate testimony against Vane, offered in a futile bid for leniency, could not soften by much. Outside the courthouse afterward, the crowd dispersing slowly into the golden late afternoon light, ranchers shaking Susan's hand and thanking her with a gratitude that clearly embarrassed her more than any danger had, Micah stood a little apart, watching her work the crowd with the same steady competence she had shown facing down gunfire in a canyon, and felt something settle inside him with the finality of a decision already made. When the crowd had finally thinned and Susan came to stand beside him on the courthouse steps, the sky behind them going soft orange and violet with the coming sunset, he took a breath and said the thing he had been turning over since somewhere around Tule Canyon. "I'm done bounty hunting," he said. I decided it's somewhere on that canyon rim. Watching a wanted poster's lie nearly get you and your evidence stolen. And I decided it again just now, sitting in that courtroom and hearing a dead man's confession clear a debt I'd been carrying since I was 19. I don't want to spend my life chasing warrants for money anymore, Susan. I want to go home and rebuild what my father built, and I find I am not much interested in doing it alone, if you'll have some say in the matter. Susan looked at him for a long moment, the last of the day's light catching the gray of her eyes and turning them nearly gold. I have a duty to finish, she said carefully. There will be depositions, and likely a trial for Vane that could take months, and Marshal Reeves's office has already asked me to consider staying on in this district permanently rather than returning to Fort Worth, given how well I apparently work under difficult conditions. A small, wry smile touched her mouth. I am not a woman who abandons her work for a man, Micah Townsend, however much I may have come, over these past 5 days, to feel something for him that I did not expect to feel for anyone again. I wouldn't ask you to abandon anything, Micah said. Willow Creek is a day's ride from the Bar T. A federal district office needs a base somewhere in this territory regardless, and I don't see why that base couldn't be here, close enough that a deputy marshal and a rancher might actually manage to see each other more evenings than not, if both of them wanted to badly enough. That's a fairly practical proposal for a man who kissed me under a canyon sunset 2 nights ago, Susan said, though her smile had widened into something unguarded. I'm a practical man, Micah said. I also meant every word of that kiss, and I mean every word of this too. I don't know exactly what shape it takes yet, Susan, whether it's courtship proper or something we build slower, figuring it out as we go the way we figured out that canyon. But I know I don't want to find out what my life looks like without you in it, and I'd rather spend the rest of my days finding that out together than spend one more year chasing other people's warrants alone. Susan was quiet a moment, watching the sunset color the false-fronted buildings of Willow Creek gold and rose, watching the trail crews driving their cattle toward the pens for the night, watching, Micah suspected, the whole shape of a future she had not allowed herself to imagine until just this moment. Then let's build it slowly, she said finally, and honestly the way we should have started from the very first evening, instead of you nearly shooting me on your own porch. I'll spend the rest of my life apologizing for that particular evening, Micah said, if it means I get to spend it with you. She laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and took his hand, and they stood together on the courthouse steps as the sun went down over Willow Creek, the wildflowers along the roadside closing up for the night, the cold rain of the past days finally given way to a clear, soft evening, and somewhere behind them in a jail cell Sela's Vane sat contemplating a ruin entirely of his own making. And somewhere ahead of them, a life neither of them had expected, but both of them now wanted lay waiting to be built, one honest day at a time. 3 months later, on a bright morning in late August, Micah Townsend stood on the porch of the Bar T Ranch house, freshly whitewashed, its windows clean and its dooryard swept, and watched Susan Dawson ride up the trail from Willow Creek on a sturdy chestnut mare she had bought with her own wages, her deputy marshal's badge catching the morning sun where it always sat pinned inside her coat, though these days she wore civilian clothes as often as not. Having accepted the district's offer to headquarter the federal marshal's office in Willow Creek itself, close enough that she made the ride out to the ranch most evenings her duties allowed. The rebuilding of the ranch had gone slowly through the summer, one board and one fence post at a time, cattle bought back a few head at a time with the small savings Micah had managed to keep from his bounty years, and it had been, he thought, watching Susan swing down from her horse with the easy confidence of someone entirely at home in this life, the best work he had ever done, better than any bounty, because every board he set now was set for something instead of merely against something. A future rather than a debt repaid. Judge Reeves handed down Vane's sentence this morning, Susan said, coming up the porch steps to where Micah waited. 15 years, federal penitentiary. Creed got 12 on account of his testimony against Vane, though I understand he's already made a great deal of noise complaining it isn't fair. Nothing about that man was ever going to strike me as fair, Micah said, but I'll take the outcome regardless. It's done then, truly done. Truly done, Susan agreed, and something in her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a case closed clean, a debt paid in full, a wrong finally righted after 2 long years of quiet injustice visited on families across the Panhandle, who had never had the resources or the standing to fight back against a man like Silas Vane alone. The Cattlemen's Trust has already begun returning deeds to every family listed in that ledger. Yours was the first, since the case built around it, but there are 11 others besides, families who will get their land back because you were brave enough to stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth about yourself, regardless of what it cost you. It cost me nothing in the end, Micah said. Cleared a debt I didn't even know had already been paid, thanks to a dying man's conscience and a clerk in Austin who happened to read the right file at the right time. Funny, the shape luck takes sometimes. I don't think it was only luck, Susan said, leaning against the porch rail beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, comfortable in a way that had grown between them slowly and surely over 3 months of shared evenings and hard, honest conversation, neither of them rushing toward anything neither was ready for, both of them building trust the same careful way Micah had rebuilt his father's fences, one solid post at a time. I think some debts get paid because the person owed them finally has the courage to come forward and settle the account honestly, instead of running from it. You could have stayed quiet in that courtroom, Micah. Plenty of men would have. You chose the truth instead, even not knowing yet how it would end for you. I had good reason to want to be a man worth trusting, Micah said, turning to look at her. Seemed important, given the company I was hoping to keep. Susan smiled, the particular warm, unguarded smile that had become, over these past months, entirely his to receive, and rare enough elsewhere that he had come to treasure the sight of it. The company appears inclined to stay kept, she said, if the man in question keeps rebuilding fences half as well as he rebuilds trust. I intend to keep doing both, Micah said, for as long as you'll let me. That, Susan said, taking his hand in hers as the late summer sun climbed higher over the Panhandle, gilding the grass gold and the bluebonnets long since gone to seed for the season, giving way now to the deeper purples and golds of high summer wildflowers, may turn out to be a considerably long time, Micah Townsend. I hope you're prepared for it. There is nothing in this world I am more prepared for, Micah said, and kissed her there on the porch of his father's ranch house, rebuilt now into something that was theirs, in the full easy light of morning, with no canyon walls to hide behind and no debts left unpaid, and no wanted posters lie left to chase either of them across 100 miles of hard Panhandle road. The bounty hunter had tracked the wrong woman clean across Texas, and found, in the wreckage of that mistake, exactly the reason he had needed all along to finally, gladly, quit.